Hi, and welcome to Section 2, Malts. Today's objectives: learning to identify the base malts and their characteristics. So before we begin, make sure you've clicked the link at the bottom of this page for the malt sensory tasting wheel. Now the main ingredient in beer is the malt. The malt is the grain, mostly barley, but it can also be wheat, oats, or even corn, as in a Corona. So when the grain gets soaked, it's going to start to sprout again. Once this grain starts to sprout a young sugary shoot, we dry it out. We can let that shoot never start, or we can let it grow long. And then when we dry it out, we could dry it lightly or roast it until we get some burnt flavors. All of these variables mean that there are lots of combinations. But here are where the carbohydrates of the beer hang out, in the malt. So how do we turn a bag of malt into beer? We soak it again, make a nice porridge like we talked about in the first unit, or a grain tea even. So let's try out some of these beers on our list. This is the fun part. It's pretty easy to see which one got the darker roasted malts. And when your flavors are this heavy and dark, well, don't be afraid to look for more than one description. You can hide a lot of flavors in a darker meal, just like you can with a beer. You can taste coffee, chocolate, maybe even burnt toast. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if it's just a hint. This brown ale, the sugars didn't burn, but they did caramelize. So you can expect a bit of a sweeter flavor. It still has a few other descriptions. Let's take a look. Do you taste roasted nuts? Perhaps a biscuit or some honey? Possibly vanilla? Maybe even cherry? Take a look at some of the descriptions in the tasting wheel and see what matches your particular beer. Now the lighter beers, they may have barely grown, or those shoots that we were talking about were barely roasted. So it might not be overwhelming, at least in the malt category. You can expect that the lighter beers may have something else going on. Either they're meant to be a nice, cool, summery beer that goes down smoothly and without too much alcohol or sugar, or someone is going to put some hops in there, and that'll get to our next category. So some pairings to think about. You've got a selection of beers. What's the language of the malt? If it's light, consider pairing it with light snacks, seafood or chicken. If you're tasting the heavier and darker roasts, look for your red meats or your darker meats. Don't let one overpower the other. So a good reminder or a good rule to go by is Guinness with steak, Pilsner with pretzels. That in-between space is where we can have our ribs, chicken, seafood, maybe even a salad. It gives us a lot of gray area to play with and fine-tune your pairing skills. Don't be afraid to try something a little outside of the normal, but here's a general idea of what you're doing. Enjoy those beers. Take a look at the tasting wheel and the evaluation sheet. Mark it down and remember it for the future times that you want to taste these beers and pair them with something. And then we can move on to our next unit when you're ready. We're going to talk about hops.